Well, there it is then. It's Jesus' fault. It's pretty clear. It's Jesus' fault. It's all about conflict. It's all about division. It's all about the sword. And boy, have we been good at that. Actually, we were really good at it before Jesus. We've always been really good at it. Good, though, that we had this reminder from Jesus to keep on doing that. Because then, when we all became, part of the church, and then the church got divided, and then we, started being mean and abusive to people and doing all of that stuff that we did historically, well, that's what Jesus told us to do, right? Right? Are you as confused as I am? This doesn't sound like the Jesus we know. It's part of the problem with sound bites, isn't it? When you take something completely out of context, and out of the context of the person saying it even, it becomes a really interesting thing that you can manipulate and use to your advantage. And we're really good at that too. Do you think the world is the way it is, full of conflict and division, full of hostility and destruction, because Jesus said that? If you're somebody who takes the Bible literally, or even believes that the Bible is the literal Word of God, it would be really easy to not want to know anything more than simply those words and turn it into that. Here's the problem with that. First of all, you probably already know this, but it bears repeating. Most biblical scholars, and this is one of the reasons why we need them, and they're so important, most biblical scholars will remind you that the Gospels, and not just the ones that appear in the Bible, all of the ones that we have that talk about Jesus and the life of Jesus, the Gospels were all written down anywhere from 30 to 100 years after the death of Jesus. In other words, none of the Gospels are in fact an eyewitness account. They were written down by somebody who heard other people telling stories, because that's how we used to do that. Oral tradition. We tell stories. So the people who started to write these things down heard stories, and they wrote them down, anywhere from 30 to 100 years after it happened. And then, of course, we transcribe, right? In the earliest days, when you were writing things down, we didn't have printing, so somebody had to write it down. So the odds were pretty good. There were perhaps some accidental errors here and there in writing things down and transcribing things. That's a possibility too. And then that takes us up to the King James Version of the Bible, where they did it on purpose. They changed stuff on purpose. And then that brings us into the era of scholarly research, trying to go back to what is the most original text that we have. But of course, even the most original text that we have is in Greek and is several hundred years after Jesus. Don't for a moment think that I think that discredits in any way the authenticity or truth of the story, because it doesn't. The truth of the story is true because it's true, not because of how somebody told it. However, it does mean this is why you need biblical scholars. Is because the people who told the story originally, Jesus, lived in a particular era and a particular time in history. The people who told the story of Jesus and shared it orally lived in a particular time in history. The people who wrote it down lived in a particular time in history. The people who then transcribed it lived in a particular time in history. The best example of that is the King James Version of the Bible, because they intentionally changed things because of the era in which they lived. Again, I don't think that that in any way discredits the authenticity or truth of the story. In fact, in some ways, it enhances what's true in the story, because what's true in the story stays true, however you tell the story, as long as you're aware of how the story is being told. So we need to know some of that historical context. We need to know some of the ways in which Jesus might have said things, or the people who wrote down things might have said things, because of the historical era in which they live. Here's a really good example. John, the Gospel of John. We know it was written later because the Gospel of John references some things that occurred much later. But it's not just the historical context either, is it? It's those references, those ways of talking, those ways of communicating that were particular to a time. And that includes things like what we currently now refer to as pop culture. It includes things like different ways of speaking, different linguistic things, right? So when we hear Jesus say certain things, it is never a good idea to take it at face value. We need to know when Jesus was talking and who he was talking to. Right? Famously, we often talk about how Jesus seemed to know his audience so well that he would tell parables that related to farmers when he was talking to rural people, and he'd tell parables that related to urban people when he was talking to urban people. He told stories that would relate to people. So we need to know what that is. We need to know that when we hear Jesus say, "I didn't come to bring peace, I came with a sword, I came to divide families, and I'm going to judge the people to determine whether or not they're worthy of me, based on whether they do what I tell them or not." And we need to know there's more to that, don't we? We need to be able to understand it in 2023. Not 400, 1550, 1960, but 2023. What's the truth that's at the heart of this? And what can it say to us? See, because if we don't, and by the way, we've been really bad at doing this, we might understand this as meaning, as long as I'm a follower of Jesus, and I think I am, I get to judge you and tell you how you should behave, and you better, because otherwise you're not worthy of Jesus. And by the way, I have a sword. How many times in history have we actually seen that? And not just with Christianity, but with other religions as well. Which is why we should all look at this story again. So, if you'll just give me a moment, I'm going to do something which you're going to immediately think is completely ridiculous. I'm going to compare Jesus to Star Trek. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Because that's something a little bit more contemporary. If Jesus told a story about Star Trek, his entire audience would go, "What? What are you talking about?" Much like you are now, because I'm going to tell a story about Star Trek. But then I'm going to explain it. The Starship Enterprise, you have to be familiar with some of this stuff because it's become part of who we are, right? Think of all of the things from Starship, from the Enterprise, from Star Trek, that are actually part of our life. Flip phones, for one. Lasers were influenced by it. Medical equipment, tablets, all of these things. In fact, they say, most scientists will tell you there's only one thing from Star Trek that they do not foresee in the future because it's just impossible. And that's the whole beaming thing, because they can't get their head past how you could disassemble a human being and reassemble them somewhere else without any degradation of quality of their being at all. That's the only thing. Everything else is doable. So the Starship Enterprise doesn't have armor the way we would conventionally consider armor right now, right? Like on tanks, ships, planes, right? It's heavy metal, inches thick. Even body armor, right? It's something solid to stop a solid object. But that's not the way the shields on the Enterprise work. They're energy. They essentially create a force field around the ship that protects it. Why? Because what it's facing primarily is energy-based weapons, right? So it creates this force field around the ship. You can't see it, but it's there. It's energy. There's an episode of Star Trek where they go to rescue a ship that's been sending out this distress signal. And they find the ship, and it looks like it's been beaten up in a battle, but it hasn't. What's actually happened is that it's encountered a part of space where there are waves of energy moving through space. And that's what damaged the ship. In fact, it killed all of the crew except for one, who they rescue, who then later on recognizes what's happening and helps one of the crewmen understand what happened. So the Enterprise then begins to encounter these same energy waves. So, of course, the first one hits the ship. It does a little bit of damage. The captain says, raise the shields. The next one does a little bit of damage. So, more power to the shields. The next wave is even stronger. More power to the shield. The fact they get to the point where they're putting everything they possibly can into those energy shields because this energy wave coming at them is so strong. And at that point, that one survivor of the other ship says, I heard them say that. And one of the crewmen on the Enterprise realized what's going on and says, drop the shields. The captain drops the shields. The energy wave just passes through them like a ripple. See, what was happening wasn't that they were defending against something that was hitting them. What was happening is that the thing was hitting them recognized that the energy was getting bigger on the other side and simply kept increasing its power in order to hit that. So the end result of that would have been either the destruction of both, the destruction of one, or a never-ending battle of smashing together. Do you see where I'm going with this? The moment you put up your shields to defend yourself, the person who's trying to communicate with you will try harder to penetrate the shields. That is a never-ending, always losing battle. If we could just learn to not, if we could learn to drop the shields and let the information come, let the difference come, let the diversity come, wouldn't things be different? Now, I know what you're thinking. The other ship was destroyed. Yes, it was, because it kept putting up a fight to ward off that other energy. But what if it hadn't? It would have realized right away what was going on. It would have been able to make a connection. How often do we do that? Fences make great neighbors. No, they don't. What they make is great division, which allows us to deal with the fact that we are here and you are there. They don't make great neighbors. If we wanted to make great neighbors, we'd have no fences and we'd share everything. I know that seems impractical, but isn't that Jesus? Isn't it? Love your neighbor as you would love yourself. How often did we see Jesus make himself vulnerable in order to be able to communicate with people? The marginalized, the angry, the hurting. How often did we see Jesus heal because he was simply willing to let go of the defenses that we put up in order to not have to engage people. How often did we see and hear stories about Jesus loving in a way that goes so far beyond what we're capable of that we think, oh, it's Jesus, we can't possibly do that. But the point of Jesus is to show you you can. You can. You know that. So when Jesus says, I don't come to bring peace, I come to bring a sword. I come to bring division. I come to break up families. I come to judge people. Listen, just for a second, and put that in the context of Jesus. Put that in the context of Jesus. And remember that peace can't be imposed. It has to be made. Remember that story about back just a few weeks recently on Ascension, the story of Jesus' ascension? And even in that moment, that last moment with Jesus, the disciples were still going, so, is now when you're going to restore Israel to its proper glory? And you just imagine Jesus like, no, that's not how this works. You still don't get it. We still don't get it. You can't impose peace. You have to make it. You can't negotiate peace. All that does is negotiate a cessation of hostility. So call it that, please, because it isn't peace. It might be a first step towards peace, but the journey to peace is long. It cannot be imposed. What it can be is covenanted. Right? So you have a contract, you negotiate a deal, you put in X, you're going to get Y out, right? That's your contract, you've negotiated that deal. So when you come to the peace table, you're negotiating so that you get something out of it, as well as what you're willing to put into it or give up usually, right? Not the same thing. A covenant means you bring everything you got and others bring everything they got and they put it in to create this new thing which wasn't there before, called peace. You can't negotiate that because what you're trying to create is something that is good for everyone, not just you. It's a covenant. And it takes work. It takes struggle. It takes conflict. The bigger issue is how are you going to address all of that conflict, engagement, discussion, all of that stuff, negotiation. How are you going to do it? There's a way. Ironically, it's the way. There is a way. The first thing you need to do is drop your shields and be open to others. Once you've done that, you can be open to others with love and care and compassion, with grace, just as Jesus. Because you see, you can. Jesus isn't trying to teach you something you can't possibly ever achieve. Will it be a struggle? Absolutely. But it will be life-giving. Even as it might feel at first as though you're giving up the life that you have. It will give life. And it will give life not just to you, it will give life to others because it's a covenant. The journey will be long. In fact, we might want to wonder right now, where are we on this journey? Are we moving forward? Are we stepping back? Where are we? There is so much conflict in the world. so much aggression, so much hostility. But the journey to life means having to struggle with that and find a way to turn it to love. Find a way to turn things like apathy to interest and care. Finding a way to turn hostility to openness and a willingness to love. The way is true and life-giving. Sometimes it doesn't matter what language you use to tell the story. Sometimes it doesn't matter what images you use to tell the story. If what's true and authentic is at the heart of it, the story will be heard. So we should try as many different ways as we can to tell the story. And you know you can. You know you can. Because there's many different ways to tell the story as there are us. As you see God in the world, as you experience God in the world, you have a story to tell. You have a story to share with others. It's your story. At the heart of it, there may be this one essential truth. We bring the kingdom of heaven here. We bring peace and rest. We bring joy and comfort by living love into the world, just as Jesus showed us to do, just as others show us to do every day in our daily lives. We don't need to put a name on it. It's love. That's not a negotiation. It's not a deal. It's love. And the covenant that we make with each other and with God and with creation brings the kingdom of heaven here.